I will never forget that Thanksgiving night in Boston, Massachusetts. It was the kind of evening that should have felt warm, comforting, and filled with gratitude, but instead it became the turning point of my entire life. My father's house, an imposing colonial brick home he had bought for $450,000 nearly 30 years ago, was filled with laughter and chatter that seemed to echo through every corner. The dining room smelled of roasted turkey, sweet potatoes layered with marshmallows, and cinnamon-spiced apple pie cooling on the counter. The table was dressed in white linen and sparkling crystal glasses, the ones my mother only brought out on holidays. To anyone else, it might have looked like the perfect picture of an American family gathering. But for me, it was a night of unveiling, a night when all the years of giving without recognition collapsed into a single moment. I sat at the long oak table, polished to a shine that reflected the chandelier above. Across from me was my brother, Michael, who had once dreamed of running his own landscaping company in Chicago. I had funded that dream, wiring him over $80,000 across 2 years, each transfer made with the hope that this time he would make something of it. But the business failed. He had no savings, no plan, and yet no shame when asking me to cover his mistakes. Beside him was his wife, sipping Chardonnay as if none of it mattered. On my right sat my sister Laura, who had floated through New York City for nearly a decade, finding herself. Her lifestyle, lofts, art classes, wellness retreats, was often paid for by me. She had once called me crying because her rent was overdue, and without hesitation, I transferred $4,500 to her landlord. She promised to repay me, but promises were all she ever had to offer. Even my parents had leaned on me. When they almost lost their summer house in Maine after falling behind on the mortgage, I had stepped in without question. I wrote the check for $90,000 that kept their lakefront property safe. They praised me for a week, calling me their savior, but soon after, it was as if that sacrifice had never happened. Over the years, I had poured more than $300,000 into keeping this family afloat. I gave quietly, steadily, because I thought that was what love looked like. Yet I never once heard a genuine thank you. That night, the turkey had just been carved and the glasses were full. My father raised his own glass, and I braced myself for a toast, expecting at least some acknowledgement of the years of effort, of what I had given. But instead, he set his wine down, leaned forward, and looked directly at me. His voice was steady, almost rehearsed, as he said, "All you ever do is take. You've never given this family anything that matters." The words landed with the force of a blade. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. My fork hovered above the cranberry sauce, my hand trembling as though my body already understood the damage before my mind caught up. I looked around the table, desperate for someone to speak up, to correct him, to remind him of the countless sacrifices I had made. But no one said a word. Michael stared at his plate, nodding faintly, as if he agreed. Laura sipped her wine, her silence more condemning than any words could have been. Even my mother, whom I had expected at least to soften the blow, sat stiff, her lips pressed into a thin line. I felt invisible, erased, as though every wire transfer, every check, every sleepless night of worrying about their problems had dissolved into nothing. My father's words weren't just cruel, they were final. They told me exactly how my family saw me, not as a daughter or sister, but as a resource, a tool, a wallet they could drain until empty. And in their eyes, I still hadn't given enough. The room carried on around me. Plates clattered, forks scraped, and conversation resumed as though nothing monumental had been said. I forced myself to chew a bite of turkey, though it tasted like cardboard in my mouth. My ears rang with his words. "All you ever do is take." They replayed, again and again, each time slicing deeper. I tried to remind myself of the countless times I had rescued them. The night Michael called me sobbing, afraid his utilities would be shut off, and I stayed awake until 2 a.m., transferring money to his account. The week Laura begged for help to pay her tuition at an expensive art program in Europe, I wired $12,000 without hesitation. The month my parents nearly defaulted on their mortgage, I canceled a much-needed vacation to send them every dollar I had saved. How could all of that mean nothing? But it did. In their eyes, it was as if I had done nothing. When dessert came out, pumpkin pie topped with whipped cream, I excused myself. My mother asked if I was feeling unwell, her tone polite, almost detached, and I simply nodded. No one pressed me. No one followed me to the door. I slipped on my coat and stepped into the November night. The air was sharp and cold, biting against my cheeks. But it was the first breath of clarity I had taken all evening. I stood at the end of the driveway, staring back at the warm glow spilling from the windows of the house, and whispered to myself, never again. Driving home, the city lights blurred past me, but my mind was painfully clear. I realized how small I had made myself to keep their lives comfortable, how much of my own future I had sacrificed to patch together theirs. I had believed that if I gave enough, they would love me. But love built on obligation, and money is not love at all. It is entitlement. I thought about my apartment in Boston, a modest 2-bedroom I had bought for $275,000 with my own hard-earned savings. It wasn't grand like my father's house, nor charming like the Maine Lake cabin, but it was mine. Paid for without help, furnished with my choices, filled with my effort. For years I had been ashamed of it, feeling it small compared to what my family flaunted. But that night I realized it was the one thing no one could diminish. It was proof that I could stand on my own. As I parked outside, the decision crystallized. I would stop. Stop sending money. Stop being their safety net. Stop erasing myself for their comfort. I would learn how to live without their approval, because their approval was nothing but control. I would build boundaries as strong as brick walls, and if they tried to break them down, I would not flinch. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the city outside my window. My father's words still echoed, but they no longer sounded like condemnation. They sounded like freedom. For the first time in years, I let the silence fill me, and instead of fear, I felt strength. Thanksgiving was supposed to be about gratitude, but for me, it became a lesson in absence. My family's absence of acknowledgement, of love without strings, of seeing me as more than a bank account. And in that absence, I found the beginning of something new. That night was not just a breaking point, it was a beginning. The week after Thanksgiving, I packed my car with only the essentials: 2 suitcases of clothes, my journals, a box of paints I hadn't touched in years, and a few books that had been gathering dust on my shelves. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. My family assumed I would come back eventually, that my silence was just a passing mood. But I knew differently. I needed space, a clean break from the suffocating cycle of giving and being diminished. I drove north out of Boston, the city fading, in my rearview mirror as the roads grew quieter and the air colder. By the time I crossed into Vermont, the trees were bare, their branches skeletal against a pale gray sky. A thin sheet of snow covered the ground, crunching under my tires as I wound my way toward Stowe. The town was charming, almost postcard perfect, with its clapboard houses, ski lodges, and little shops strung with twinkling lights for the holiday season. But I wasn't there for charm. I was there to disappear, at least for a while. I had found the cabin through a rental listing online, a 2-bedroom log structure tucked away on the edge of the woods. The rent was $200 a month, more than I wanted to spend, but less than the cost of my sanity. When I pulled up the gravel driveway and saw it for the first time, my heart tightened. The cabin wasn't grand or polished, but it had a stone fireplace, shuttered windows, and a porch that overlooked the rolling mountains. Smoke curled from the chimney, as if it had been waiting for me. For the first time in years, I felt I had arrived somewhere that was entirely mine. The inside was modest, wood-paneled walls, a threadbare rug, and a mismatched couch that sagged in the middle. The kitchen was small, with old appliances that hummed louder than they should, and the second bedroom smelled faintly of cedar. But I didn't care. After years of walking into houses that belonged to other people, my father's, my sister's, my parents' summer home, this little cabin felt like a sanctuary. The first night, I lit a fire and sat in silence, watching the flames dance across the logs. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, Michael's name flashing across the screen. I let it ring. then Laura, then my mother. I ignored them all. Their messages piled up one after another, the familiar rhythm of demands and guilt. Please, I just need a little help to get through this month. Your sister is struggling, don't you care? Family means sacrifice. Don't turn your back on us now. Each one was a hook meant to pull me back into their chaos. But I stayed still, staring at the fire until the phone went dark. Days began to take on a new rhythm. In the mornings, I walked the snow-dusted trails behind the cabin. The air was so crisp it stung my lungs, but the silence was healing. No cars, no voices, just the crunch of my boots and the whisper of wind through the pines. I would walk for an hour, sometimes two, until the tips of my fingers grew numb, and then I'd return to the warmth of the cabin. Afternoons were for writing. I set up a small desk by the window and filled journal after journal with the thoughts I had never spoken aloud. I wrote about the years I had lost chasing approval, about the nights I had cried after wiring away my last dollar, about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who only valued me for what I could give. The words poured out of me like a confession, raw and unfiltered. Each page felt like shedding a weight I had carried for too long. But what surprised me most was the painting. I hadn't picked up a brush since college, when I once dreamed of being an artist. Life had pushed that dream aside. Steady jobs, financial obligations, family demands had consumed me. One afternoon, I opened the box of paints I had brought and spread them across the wooden table. I dipped the brush into a pool of cobalt blue and dragged it across the canvas. The stroke was uneven, hesitant at first, but then another followed, and another. Hours slipped by without my noticing. By the time I looked up, the sun had set and the fire was crackling low. On the canvas was a rough but vivid mountain scene, the snowy peaks bathed in a pink-orange sky. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. Painting became my therapy. Each day, I lost myself in color and shape, creating landscapes that reflected not just the Vermont wilderness around me, but also the inner world I had long ignored. My hands, once cramped from typing account numbers and balancing other people's bills, now moved with freedom. The cabin walls soon filled with canvases, each one a piece of myself I had thought was gone forever. Still, the outside world kept trying to intrude. My phone is filled with voicemails from Michael. "You're my sister, you can't abandon me. I'll pay you back this time, I swear." Laura's emails grew sharper. "It's selfish to cut yourself off. Do you even know what I'm going through?" My mother's texts were the hardest. "Family is forever. You will regret this when we're gone." Each message tugged at me, but I resisted. I didn't respond, didn't explain. For once, my silence was louder than their demands. The quiet gave me clarity. I began to see how much of my identity had been tied to rescuing them. I wasn't their daughter or sister in their eyes. I was their bank, their problem solver, the buffer between their choices and their consequences. And I had allowed it, mistaking sacrifice for love. One evening, as the snow fell in thick flakes outside, I sat by the fire and reread an entry from my journal. If I stop giving, will they still love me? The answer, I realized, was already clear. Their love had always been conditional, dependent on my willingness to bleed myself dry. Without my money, without my constant yes, I was disposable to them. And that truth, as painful as it was, also set me free. Weeks turned into months, and the cabin became more than a refuge. It became a classroom where I relearned myself. I cooked simple meals, read books late into the night, and painted until my hands were speckled with color. I stopped checking my bank balance with dread and began to think of money not as something to be given away, but as something that could finally serve me. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of disappointing anyone, because the only person I was living for was myself. One morning in late January, I opened the curtains to see the mountains glowing in the sunrise, their peaks bathed in gold. I brewed a cup of coffee, sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, and watched as the world woke up around me. The silence, which had once felt strange, now felt sacred. I realized I had found something more valuable than approval, more enduring, than family obligation. I had found peace. The cabin taught me that stepping away wasn't abandonment. It was survival. It gave me the space to breathe, to rediscover who I was beneath the layers of expectation. My family might have believed I was selfish for leaving, but the truth was that I had finally chosen to live. And as I looked out at the snow-covered hills, I knew this was only the beginning. Silence, I learned, can be louder than any words. For weeks, I ignored the phone calls, the texts, the emails that tried to pull me back into my old role. At first, I thought they would grow tired and stop, but I underestimated how deeply my family had come to depend on me. My refusal to give wasn't a quiet shift, it was an earthquake. And like all earthquakes, it shook loose everything fragile they had been balancing on top of me. The first blow came in a thick white envelope delivered to the cabin one snowy morning. I had been sipping coffee by the window, watching the pines bend beneath the weight of the season's heaviest storm, when I saw the letter slide beneath my door. My name was typed in bold across the front, the return address belonging to my father's attorney in Boston. My hands trembled as I tore it open, though I already sensed the venom inside. It was a legal notice, cold and calculated. My father was contesting ownership of the lake cabin in Maine. The same cabin where I had spent countless summer days as a child, and the same one I had saved by paying off the $90,000 mortgage when my parents were drowning in debt. The letter claimed I had no rightful stake in the property, that any payments I had made had been gifts and therefore irrelevant. Gifts. As if my sacrifice had been no more than spare change dropped into a jar. I felt fury course through me, hot and sharp. For years I had rescued them, and now they dared to take from me what was legally, indisputably mine. I slammed the papers onto the table and laughed bitterly, the sound echoing in the small cabin. It was a hollow, humorless laugh, the kind that comes when you finally see someone's cruelty laid bare. The attacks didn't end there. Within days, Michael began spreading rumors. He told distant relatives in Chicago and Boston that I had stolen from him, that I had taken thousands he had entrusted me with, and refused to return them. The irony nearly made me choke. I had given him more than $80,000 over the years, money that disappeared into failed ventures and bad choices. Yet now, in his desperation, he recast himself as the victim and me as the thief. Laura took her battle public. On social media, she painted me as cold, heartless, and selfish. She wrote long posts about family betrayal, about how I had abandoned her in her time of need. People who had never met me commented with sympathy for her, calling me cruel and greedy. I read her words late at night, my phone screen glowing in the darkness of the cabin. Each sentence was a blade, but not because they were true, because they were lies spoken with conviction. She knew her audience. She knew pity could be a currency. At first, I felt crushed under the weight of it all. My own family had turned me into a villain in the eyes of anyone who would listen. The voices in my head began to whisper doubts. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am selfish. Maybe I should have just kept helping. But then I remembered the Thanksgiving night when my father told me I had never given anything that mattered. If all the years of sacrifice had amounted to nothing in their eyes, then what good would more giving do? It was time to fight back, not with rage or more lies, but with truth. I hired my own attorney in Boston, a woman named Claire who came highly recommended. She was sharp, precise, and unapologetic, exactly what I needed. Her retainer fee was $15,000, money that I hesitated to part with, but ultimately paid because this was about more than property. This was about drawing a line that could not be crossed. Claire combed through every bank statement, every wire transfer, every signed receipt that showed the $90,000 mortgage payoff had come directly from me. The cabin in Maine was legally deeded in my name, and the documents bore my signature. "They don't have a leg to stand on," she said firmly during our first meeting. For the first time in weeks, I felt the knot in my chest loosen, while the legal process moved forward. The personal battles continued. My mother called one evening, her voice shaking with what she wanted me to believe was sorrow. "You're tearing this family apart," she said. "Is a piece of property really worth more than us? Worth more than your father?" I held the phone to my ear, silent, letting her words sink in. I wanted to scream that it wasn't about the property, that it was about their constant erasure of my sacrifices, their entitlement to everything I had. But instead, I simply said, "I'm done being used." And then I hung up. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we could have had. What surprised me most during that time was how calm I felt in the face of their desperation. For years, I had been the one scrambling to cover bills, to patch holes, to save them from themselves. Now it was they scrambling, their carefully constructed safety net gone, and I, for once, stood firm. I began to see their behavior for what it truly was: fear. Without my money, they had to face the reality of their own choices. Michael had to acknowledge the business he had squandered. Laura had to admit that her life of drifting was unsustainable. My parents had to confront their poor financial planning and the fragility of their so-called security. They didn't want me back out of love. They wanted me back as a shield against the consequences they had long avoided. The lies, the rumors, the legal threats, all of it was their way of clawing at me, desperate to restore the old balance. But the old balance was gone. The case over the main cabin dragged on for months, each side filing motions and responses. Every time my attorney called with an update, I felt another layer of my old fear peel away. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't the timid daughter sitting quietly at Thanksgiving while my father cut me down. I was a woman standing in the storm, unflinching. When the final ruling came, the judge sided with me completely. The cabin was mine, beyond dispute. The paperwork was clear, the law undeniable. My father's attorney had no grounds to challenge it. The victory wasn't just about the property. It was about reclaiming a part of myself I had nearly lost. For once, my sacrifices were acknowledged, even if only in the language of law. Michael stopped calling after that. Laura's social media tirades dwindled until they disappeared altogether. My parents retreated into silence, too proud to admit defeat, too angry to forgive. And me? I felt a peace I had never known. The lies they spread lingered in the air for a while, whispered among relatives and acquaintances. But I stopped caring. I realized that truth doesn't need to shout. It simply stands, steady and immovable, until the noise around it fades. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing their approval, wasn't buying their acceptance. I was free to choose my battles, free to walk away from the endless cycle of giving, free to define myself not by what I provided for others, but by what I built for myself. The storm they had unleashed to break me had instead revealed my strength. And as I stood on the porch of my Vermont cabin, looking out over the snow-covered hills, I knew one thing for certain: I would never go back. 2 years after the court ruling, I stood on the dock of the main lake one last time with the keys in my pocket and a contract in my bag. The buyer, a couple from Virginia who wanted a summer place for their grandchildren, had offered $600,000. I accepted without haggling. The cabin had been my proof that I could fight for myself. Now, it could be my bridge to something gentler. I walked through each room and ran my hand along the familiar pine walls. The house had kept me safe, but it also held the echo of arguments and letters and long nights waiting for updates from my attorney. I locked the door and did not look back. I drove south along the spine of the Appalachians, following a route I had traced on paper a dozen times. I stopped overnight in small towns where the diner coffee tasted like courage and the motel sheets smelled like bleach and relief. When the Blue Ridge Mountains rolled into view, the world seemed to tilt. I felt as if I were turning a corner inside my own life. Asheville waded in a basin of green hills and bright murals, old brick warehouses turned into studios, thrift stores filled with chairs that wanted a second life. I had been scrolling listings for months, saving any place with a little light, a little garden, a little promise. The cottage I chose sat at the bend of a quiet street not far from the River Arts District. It had white shutters and a wraparound porch that creaked when I stepped on the second board near the railing. When I toured it the first afternoon, cardinals flicked through a maple tree and the yard smelled like damp earth. The price was $320,000. I put down $160,000 from the sale of the lake place, covered the closing costs in cash, and took a manageable mortgage for the rest. For once, the math served my peace rather than my panic. I signed the papers with steady hands and slid the pen back across the lawyer's desk, as if I were returning a tool I knew how to use. The house was small and honest. A living room that warmed quickly, a kitchen with a window over the sink, 2 bedrooms that faced the morning. The floors were oak and had a stubborn scuff that would not sand out. I decided to keep it. Not every mark needs fixing. I painted the walls a quiet white and sewed simple linen curtains for the windows. With what was left from the sale, I set a clear budget. $2,000 to refinish the porch, $1,200 for a secondhand stove that would not sputter, $800 for soil, trellises, and a handful of rose bushes. I kept a ledger on the hall table and recorded every decision. The old me had given money away in secret and in shame. The woman who lived in this cottage chose where her dollars went and why. Neighbors introduced themselves with a mix of curiosity and kindness. Eleanor lived next door in a blue bungalow with a bell on the gate. She was a retired history teacher from Virginia, the sort of person who kept bees and stories in equal measure. On my first weekend, she knocked with a plate of lemon cookies and a short speech about the neighborhood book club that met on Tuesdays. I promised I would come and then showed up with a stack of paperbacks tied with a piece of twine. Grace arrived a few days later. She was a writer who rented a studio near the river and liked to walk past my porch because the lavender smelled like summers she once spent in Cornwall. We started with coffee and ended with hours of conversation about art, work, and the trouble of being a woman people think they can use. I turned the small second bedroom into a studio. I set a table near the window and leaned canvas against the wall until the room looked like it was waiting for weather. My hands remembered the old rhythm. I returned to the blues and grays of the Vermont mountains, and then drifted toward the soft greens of the Asheville hills. When I painted the porches and the cracked sidewalks on my street, I saw light where I used to see duty. I took 10 paintings to a local gallery in March, a little space run by a patient man named Marcus who wore paint on his cuffs and enthusiasm in his voice. He hung 2 pieces and sold them within a week for $500 each. The gallery kept its commission, and I took home a check and a postcard with both red dots circled in pen. I taped the postcard above my desk like a promise. Money took on a new shape. I set a rule. No gifts that pretend to be love. No love that pretends to be a bill. I gave to causes that mattered to me, and I priced my work without apology. If someone asked for a discount that made me shrink, I chose to say no and offered them a smaller piece instead. Eleanor bought a small canvas of the maple tree in my front yard. She insisted on paying full price, and then added $20 because she liked the way the sun looked on the leaves. I cried after she left her envelope on my porch swing and signed the back of her painting with careful letters, the way my art professor once told me to do when I believed I might become someone. The garden became a kind of prayer. I planted lavender and roses along the picket fence and thyme near the porch steps. By July, the bees worked the flowers like a shift. They enjoyed, and the air smelled like tea. I learned how to prune and how to wait. Some mornings I carried a bowl of blueberries to the porch and watched joggers pass in pairs, the early light pooling in the street's low places. I wrote my budget numbers in a notebook, and they added up to enough. I slept through the night without the strange sound of a notification waking me with dread. Silence, which had been my defense, became my home. The final severing came the following autumn. My father sent a letter in his own hand for the first time in years. He wrote that the Boston house was under strain, that property taxes had gone up, that he did not want to lose a home he had loved. The last paragraph asked if I would consider a loan. He said it would only be a bridge. He called me his daughter, and underlined the word twice. I read the letter on the porch, and then read it again. My hands did not shake. I wrote a short reply and kept it plain. I wished him well. I reminded him that I no longer provided financial support. I said that I hoped he would find the resources he needed. I signed my name without an apology. I did not leave a door open that I did not intend to walk through. After that, my phone quieted in a way that felt true. Michael stopped reaching out. Laura shifted her speeches to a new audience. My mother sent a Christmas card that showed a winter scene, but no note. I placed it in a drawer with my property deed, my budget, and the postcard with the red dots from the gallery. Not every story needs an answer. Some only need a place to rest. I kept building the life that fit me. I taught a weekend workshop at the gallery on color mixing and watched 3 teenagers find a sky inside an unexpected gray. I joined Eleanor at the library on Thursday nights, where a group read memoirs, and underlined without guilt. Grace and I met once a week for long walks along the French Broad River, and we talked about chapters and canvases and the way women learn to walk out without apologizing. In the spring, a cafe near the square asked to hang 4 of my pieces on the brick wall behind the counter. They sold in a month. A couple visiting from Ohio said my paintings reminded them of something. I took the compliment home and gave it its own shelf. The cottage asked for ordinary things, and I found joy in giving them. I learned the names of my tools. I patched a leak beneath the kitchen sink with a new wrench and a quiet curse. I sanded and sealed the porch and set a wide chair in the corner where the light arrived first. In the evenings, I made simple dinners and called them good. I kept a small envelope in the kitchen drawer labeled Grace and Kindness, and I added $20 bills when a commission came through or when I shipped a painting to a buyer in Oregon. When I heard about a neighbor whose car needed a new tire, I slid the envelope into her mailbox with a note that said, "From your street." The gift felt clean because it was chosen. Sometimes I sat on the porch and tried to name what had changed. Boundaries sounded like a hard word when I first learned how to use it. In Asheville, it sounded like a fence with a gate I controlled, a garden I could tend without trespass. I did not become hard. It became clear there is a difference. I let people in who brought respect and left the rest outside, where their voices dimmed to a far hum. On the 2nd anniversary of my move, I hosted a small gathering. Eleanor brought honey from her hives. Grace carried in a pie that tasted like lemon and sunlight. Marcus arrived late, as always, with a bottle of sparkling cider and news about a group show that wanted a series of my porch paintings. We ate on the steps and talked until the streetlights blinked on. I looked at the 3 of them and thought about the strange arithmetic of life. I had given away years trying to earn love that did not exist. Now I gave my time to people who met me as I am, and somehow there was more of me left over, not less. That night, after the dishes were washed and the porch smelled faintly of sugar and beeswax, I sat alone and listened to the crickets. I thought about the woman who drove to Vermont with a trunk full of paint and a heart full of fear. I thought about the courtroom, the dock in Maine, the lawyer's office where the pen felt heavy in my hand. I thought about the long drive south and the first morning I unlocked this cottage door. Each moment felt like a step across a bridge I had built out of my own decisions. I do not pretend that everything is simple. There are days when the past tugs like a loose thread and I have to put the sweater down and walk away. There are mornings when I count bills twice and choose beans over steak with the quiet pride of someone who knows what she is doing. There are nights when I dream about my father's house and wake with an ache that is more memory than wish. I let the ache sit beside me at the table while I drink my coffee. Then I open the studio door and pick up a brush. The sun reaches the porch by mid-morning and lays a clean stripe across the floorboards. I often pause my painting and step outside to stand in that warm band of light. I breathe in the lavender. I watch bees work the soft purple blooms with a focus I admire. In the distance, the hills lean into the sky, and I feel the old weight lift again, as if it has finally learned that I will not carry it. This is the life I chose. It is smaller, in square footage and larger in truth. It is held together by the people who show up with cookies and ideas, and patience. It is paid for with money I earned and guarded by boundaries I now understand. I give, but I do not leak. I love, but I do not disappear. Respect does not come from sacrifice. It grows out of the clear ground where I planted my self-worth and tended it with both hands. When I sit on the porch in the late afternoon and the light turns the roses into small lanterns, I feel something I once thought belonged only to other people. I feel free.